Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe, as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, hauntings, they were just stories people told to scare one another, right? So when my friends invited me to join them on a ghost hunt at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, I laughed it off. I figured it would be a fun way to spend a night, maybe get a few cheap thrills, but nothing more. Little did I know I was about to experience something that would change my perspective on the supernatural forever. Waverly Hills Sanatorium had a dark and tragic history. Originally built in the early 1900s as a tuberculosis hospital, it had seen countless deaths over the years. The patients who didn't survive the deadly disease were said to have been transported through an underground tunnel known as the body chute, to avoid demoralizing the other patients. After it closed as a hospital, stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and unexplained occurrences began to circulate, drawing paranormal enthusiasts from all over the country. Our group arrived at the sanatorium just as the sun was beginning to set. The massive, decaying building loomed over us, its windows dark and empty like hollow eyes. As we walked toward the entrance, the wind whistled through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling, reminding myself that it was just an old, abandoned building, nothing to be afraid of. The guide met us at the entrance and gave us a brief history of the place, pointing out the different areas where paranormal activity had been reported. Room 502, where a nurse had allegedly committed suicide. The death tunnel, where the bodies of deceased patients were transported. And the fifth floor, where shadowy figures were often seen lurking in the hallways. We split into smaller groups and began our investigation, armed with flashlights, cameras, and voice recorders. My group started on the first floor, exploring the empty patient rooms and long, dark corridors. At first, it was just as I had expected, creepy, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary. The building creaked and groaned with age, and the wind rattled the broken windows, but there were no ghosts, no spirits, just the remnants of a forgotten past. As the night wore on, however, things began to change. It started with small things, a cold breeze brushing past me when there was no one, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway when no one was there. My friend, Sarah, who was more sensitive to these things, kept insisting that she felt a presence following us. I brushed it off, telling her it was just her imagination, but deep down, I was starting to feel uneasy too. Around midnight, we decided to check out the infamous Room 502. The room was small and unremarkable, with peeling wallpaper and a broken window that looked out over the grounds. As we stood there, discussing the rumors of the nurse's suicide, I suddenly felt a heavy pressure on my chest, like someone was pressing down on me. It was hard to breathe, and for a moment, I thought I was having a panic attack. I backed out of the room, trying to calm myself down, but the feeling only intensified. It was as if the air around me had thickened, making it hard to move, hard to think. Sarah came to check on me, but as soon as she stepped into the hallway, she froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I turned to look where she was pointing and saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. At first I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk toward us. My heart raced as we backed away, unsure of what to do. The figure was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness, but there was something distinctly malevolent about it. As it drew closer, the air around us grew colder, and the oppressive feeling in my chest intensified. I grabbed Sarah's arm and whispered for her to run, but she was frozen in place, her eyes locked on the approaching figure. Just as it was about to reach us, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind, breaking the spell. Another one of our group members came rushing down the hallway, and the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, both of us too shaken to speak. We decided to leave room 500 and head back to the first floor, hoping to regroup with the others and shake off the terrifying encounter. But as we made our way down the stairs, the strange occurrences only intensified. On the second floor, we heard the sound of children laughing, echoing through the empty halls. We followed the sound to a small room that had once been a playroom for the young tuberculosis patients. The room was empty, save for a few broken toys scattered across the floor, but the laughter continued, growing louder and more frantic. I shone my flashlight around the room, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. No children, no spirits, just the eerie echo of laughter that seemed to come from nowhere. Sarah insisted that we leave, but I was determined to capture some evidence of what we were experiencing. I pulled out my camera and began snapping photos of the room, hoping to catch something on film. As I reviewed the photos, my stomach dropped. In one of the images, there was a faint outline of a child standing in a corner of the room. It was barely visible, just a shadowy figure that seemed to blend into the darkness. But it was there. I showed the photo to Sarah, and her face went pale. We both knew what we had seen, and we didn't need any more convincing. The rest of the night passed in a blur of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, shadowy figures moving in the distance, cold spots that sent shivers down our spines. By the time dawn broke, we were all exhausted, both physically and emotionally. As we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that the spirits of Waverly Hills weren't ready to let us go. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced, telling myself that it was just the power of suggestion, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Waverly Hills was haunted by the souls of those who had suffered and died there, by the memories of a dark and tragic past. And while I may have left the sanatorium behind, I knew that a part of me would always remain there, haunted by the spirits of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. The decision to hike Devil's Ridge was a spontaneous one. My friends and I were avid hikers, always looking for the next challenge, the next breathtaking view. We'd heard about the ridge from some fellow hikers how it was one of the most difficult trails in the state, with steep inclines, rugged terrain, and a history of unexplained disappearances. The last part intrigued us, adding an element of mystery to the adventure. I wish now that we had listened to the warnings instead of brushing them off as exaggerated campfire tales. The day we set out, the sky was a clear, cloudless blue, the kind of day that made you feel invincible. We were a group of 5: myself, Sarah, Mike, Jess, and Ben, all experienced hikers who had tackled some of the toughest trails in the country. We weren't worried about Devil's Ridge. We had our gear, our maps, and plenty of supplies. As we started the ascent, the trail was everything we expected, steep, rocky, and challenging, but the views were worth it. From the ridge, you could see for miles the rolling hills, dense forests, and the winding river far below. It was stunning, the kind of scenery that makes you forget the effort it took to get there. We stopped often to take pictures, to rest, to marvel at the beauty around us. As the day went on, the trail became more treacherous. The path narrowed, hugging the side of the mountain with a sheer drop on one side. We had to be careful, watching every step, especially as the light began to fade. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the trail, and the temperature started to drop. We hadn't planned to camp overnight, but it became clear that we wouldn't make it back down before dark. We found a small clearing off the trail, just big enough to set up our tents. The mood was light as we gathered around the campfire, joking about the so-called haunted ridge and the people who had supposedly gone missing. We were confident, maybe a little too much so, and didn't take the stories seriously. But as the fire crackled and the night grew darker, a sense of unease began to settle over us. It started with a sound of faint, rustling noise coming from the trees. We all heard it, but no one said anything at first, chalking it up to the wind or maybe an animal. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. Jess was the first to speak up, asking if anyone else had heard it. We all nodded, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Mike grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, but we didn't see anything. Still, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was hard to shake. We tried to brush it off, to go back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. Eventually, one by one, we retreated to our tents, hoping that sleep would come quickly. It didn't. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifying every small noise. I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But the rustling continued, closer now, accompanied by what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, almost as if someone was circling our camp. My heart raced as I strained to hear more, but then the sounds stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken away. It was Sarah, her face pale in the dim light of dawn. Ben was gone. His tent was empty, his gear untouched, as if he had simply vanished during the night. Panic set in as we called his name, searching the area around our camp. There was no sign of him, no tracks, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. We decided to split up and search the trail, thinking maybe he had gone for an early morning hike and lost his way. But as we scoured the area, it became clear that something was very wrong. The trail itself seemed to have changed sections that we had passed the day before now looked unfamiliar, the path twisting in ways it hadn't before. The forest around us felt different, the trees closer together, the underbrush thicker, as if the mountain itself was shifting, trying to keep us from finding our way back. Hours passed with no sign of Ben. We were exhausted, terrified, and completely lost. The map we had was useless now, the landmarks no longer matching up with what we were seeing. It was as if we had been transported to another place entirely, a place that didn't want us to leave. The sun was beginning to set again when we heard a distant cry, faint but unmistakable. It was Ben. We ran toward the sound, hope surging in our chests. But as we got closer, that hope turned to dread. His voice was coming from somewhere deep in the forest, far off the trail, in a direction we hadn't gone before. We should have turned back, but we didn't. We couldn't leave him, not after hearing his voice. We pushed through the underbrush, the trees closing in around us, the light fading fast. The closer we got, the more twisted the forest became, the trees gnarled and ancient, their branches clawing at us as we passed. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the crying stopped. We found ourselves in a small clearing, the ground bare except for a single, weathered gravestone. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and the silence was oppressive. There was no sign of Ben, no tracks, nothing to explain what we had heard. Just that gravestone, its inscription worn away by time. We stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. Then the wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it a sound that chilled me to the bone, a low, guttural growl, like an animal's, but deeper, more menacing. We ran. I don't remember much of the descent, only that it was a blur of trees and rocks, our only thought being to get off that mountain as fast as possible. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun had set, and the stars were out. We collapsed in the parking lot, gasping for breath, too exhausted and terrified to speak. Ben was never found. Search teams combed the mountain for weeks, but they didn't find a trace of him. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, but I knew better. Whatever took him wasn't something that could be explained by a simple accident or getting lost. We never spoke of that hike again. The others moved on, trying to forget, but I couldn't. I still hear his voice sometimes, in the dead of night, calling for help from somewhere deep in the woods. And every time, I wonder if it's really him or if it's something else, something that wants me to come back to Devil's Ridge. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just a short escape from the grind of daily life. I needed to clear my head, to get away from the city and its relentless noise. A friend had told me about an old cabin deep in the woods, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and nature. It wasn't on any map, but he assured me it was still standing, though no one had stayed there in years. He called it a hidden gem, perfect for someone looking to disconnect. I packed light, just the essentials, a couple of days' worth of food, some basic camping gear, and a good book. I wasn't planning on doing much more than hiking a little and enjoying the peace and quiet. The directions my friend gave me were vague, but I trusted him. After all, he knew these woods better than anyone I knew. The drive out to the forest was uneventful. The road narrowed as I went deeper into the wilderness, the trees closing in on either side until they formed a canopy overhead. Eventually, the pavement turned to gravel, and the gravel to dirt. I passed a few signs warning of rough terrain, but I pressed on. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt, but that was exactly what I wanted. I reached the end of the dirt road and parked my car. According to my friend's directions, the cabin was about a mile hike from where I was. I shouldered my pack and started walking. The trail, if you could call it that, was overgrown with brambles and branches snagging at my clothes as I pushed through, but there was something invigorating about it, the sense of adventure. The idea that I was venturing into a place few people had seen in years. After about an hour, I found the cabin. It was just as my friend had described it, small, weathered, and half hidden by the encroaching forest. The wood was gray and splintered, the windows clouded with age, but it was still standing, and it looked sturdy enough. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was bare. Just a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust. There was a fireplace in one corner, a small table, and a couple of chairs. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I explored the single room, but it felt solid. This would do nicely for the next couple of days. I set up my gear and packed some food and made a small fire in the fireplace. As the sun began to set, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood and the sounds of the forest outside. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The temperature dropped rapidly and a strange feeling settled over the cabin. It wasn't cold exactly, but there was a chill in the air that I couldn't shake. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, grew eerily quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, and even that seemed muted, as if the flames were burning in a vacuum. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild in the isolation. I was out in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization, and it was natural to feel a little on edge. But the feeling persisted, knowing at the edges of my mind that it was around midnight when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling outside the cabin. I froze, listening intently. It could have been anything, a deer, a raccoon, maybe even just the wind. But then the rustling grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the cabin. I stood up, my heart racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees outside, but I saw nothing. Still, the noise continued, a shuffling, scraping sound that sent chills down my spine. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, but deep down I knew better. There was something off about the sound, something that didn't belong. I slowly backed away from the window, my mind racing with possibilities. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the nothingness. I wanted to open the door, to see if there was anything out there, but a primal fear kept me rooted in place. Every instinct was telling me to stay inside, to stay quiet, to stay hidden. And then, without warning, the door rattled in its frame. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. Something was outside, something big, pushing against the door. The flimsy would creak under the pressure, and I could hear a low, guttural growl coming from the other side. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I didn't have any weapons, nothing that could protect me if whatever was out there decided to break in. I was trapped. The door rattled again, harder this time, and I could see it bowing inward under the strain. Whatever was out there was stronger than any animal I'd ever encountered. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear heavy breathing, like that of a large predator. I fumbled for my pack, searching for something, anything that I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around the handle of a small hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The door creaked again, the wood splintering at the edges. I raised the hatchet, ready to defend myself, but I knew it would be a futile effort. Whatever was out there was too powerful, too dangerous. And then, just as I thought the door was about to give way, the growling stopped. The cabin fell silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing. I waited, tense, expecting the door to burst open at any moment, but nothing happened. Minutes passed, and the silence stretched on. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I stood there, hatchet in hand, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the cabin remained still, the door closed, and the night outside eerily quiet. Eventually, I forced myself to lower the hatchet, my arms trembling from the tension. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. I packed up my things as quickly and quietly as I could, keeping one eye on the door the entire time. As soon as I was ready, I made my way to the window and peered outside. The forest was dark, the moon obscured by thick clouds, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Whatever had been out there was gone at least, for now I moved to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I unlocked it and pushed it open, the rusty hinges creaking in protest. The cold night air rushed in, but there was no sign of the creature. I stepped outside, hatchet in hand, ready for anything, but the night was silent, the forest still. I didn't waste any time. I headed straight for the trail, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my heart racing, but nothing came after me. I made it back to my car in record time, threw my pack in the back, and tore out of there without looking back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night in the woods. I've heard the stories, the legends of the dogman, a creature half-man, half-wolf, that stalks the forests of the Midwest. I always thought they were just that, stories. But after what happened, I'm not so sure anymore. I haven't told my friend what happened. Haven't told anyone. I'm not sure they would believe me if I did. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I know I'll never set foot in those woods again. I never considered myself particularly brave, but something about the thrill of exploring abandoned places always drew me in. Maybe it was the stories that seemed to cling to these forgotten buildings like cobwebs in the corners, tales of tragedy and mystery that only heightened the experience. This time, it was an old hospital on the outskirts of town, left to decay since the 1970s. It had a reputation for being cursed, a place where people would enter and come out ... different. I first heard about the hospital from an old friend, Marcus, who shared my penchant for urban exploration. He was the one who suggested it, and as soon as he did, I felt a chill run down my spine. The stories surrounding this place were grim. Patients who had never made it out, doctors who had gone mad within its walls, and even rumors of occult rituals in the basement. Still, I couldn't resist. We set out on a cold, drizzly evening, the kind that turns everything into shades of gray. The hospital was hidden deep within a forest, its location almost as if it were meant to be forgotten. The journey there was uneventful, with Marcus and I making small talk to fill the silence that grew heavier as we approached. When we finally arrived, the hospital loomed over us like a monument to despair, its windows shattered and the roof partially collapsed. The front entrance was blocked by debris, so we circled the building, eventually finding an open side door that creaked ominously as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mold and decay. The walls were peeling, revealing layers of paint and plaster that seemed to tell the building's long, tragic history. As we moved deeper into the hospital, the light from our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. The operating rooms were particularly unsettling, with tables that still had old, dried stains on them, whether from blood or something else I didn't want to know. Marcus was oddly quiet, more so than usual, and I could sense his unease growing with each step we took. Maybe we should head upstairs, I suggested, trying to break the tension. Marcus nodded, but his usual enthusiasm was gone, replaced by a wary apprehension that was starting to get to me as well. The stairwell was narrow and steep, with several steps missing or broken. We carefully made our way up to the second floor, where the atmosphere felt even heavier, as if the air itself was thick with the past. It was colder up there, and I noticed the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something rotten. It was as if the hospital had absorbed all the pain, fear, and suffering from its past, and was now exuding it back into the present. The second floor was much the same as the first, a labyrinth of empty rooms and corridors. But there was something different here, a sense of being watched, I felt it as soon as we stepped onto the landing, an unmistakable prickling on the back of my neck. I glanced at Marcus, who was pale and clearly unnerved. "You feel that?" I asked quietly. "Yeah," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just check it out quickly and get out of here." We moved cautiously, sticking close together. As we explored, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were not alone, that something or someone was lurking just out of sight. We reached what appeared to be the nurse's station, a large, open area with a desk in the center and several hallways branching off from it. The desk was covered in old, yellowed papers and a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. I was about to suggest we head back down when we heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone breathing. We both froze, listening intently. The sound came again, this time closer, and my heart began to race. Marcus slowly raised his flashlight, pointing it down one of the dark hallways. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only more empty rooms and broken furniture. Then the sound came again, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming from the hallway directly in front of us. "Who's there?" Marcus called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, just the steady sound of footsteps getting closer. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was another explorer, or perhaps a squatter. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. "Let's go," I whispered urgently, pulling on Marcus's arm. He didn't resist, and we began to back away slowly, keeping our eyes fixed on the hallway. The footsteps continued to approach, and as they did, the air grew colder, the smell of rot more intense. I could feel my breath hitching, fear clawing at my throat. We turned and hurried back the way we came, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. But as we reached the stairwell, something caught my movement in the corner of the room. I turned my head just in time to see a figure step out of the shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs and a face that was little more than a void. I couldn't see its features, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. I let out a strangled gasp, and Marcus followed my gaze. His eyes widened in terror, and, without a word, we bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in our haste. The footsteps behind us quickened, matching our pace. I didn't dare look back. The only thought in my mind was to get out, to escape whatever horror was pursuing us. We reached the first floor and sprinted towards the side door we had entered through. But when we reached it, we found it closed, though neither of us had shut it. Marcus frantically pushed against it, but it wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Come on," he yelled, desperation creeping into his voice. I glanced over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. The figure was at the top of the stairs now, its head cocked to the side as it watched us. It didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for us to make our next move. "We need to find another way out," I said, my voice shaking. Marcus nodded, his face pale with fear. We turned and ran deeper into the hospital, searching for another exit. The building seemed to close in around us, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, shifting and changing to keep us trapped. Finally, we found a door that led to a basement. It wasn't what we were hoping for, but it was our only option. We descended the stairs, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The basement was dark, the only light coming from our flashlights, which flickered as if struggling to stay on. The basement was a maze of old storage rooms and mechanical equipment. The smell of mold was overpowering, mixed with something far worse, the stench of death. We stumbled through the darkness, our footsteps echoing off the walls. I could hear Marcus muttering under his breath, praying for a way out. Then we found it, a rusty door at the far end of the basement. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but it was our only hope. We rushed to it, and with a few hard pulls the door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that led out into the forest. We didn't hesitate. We squeezed through the opening and ran, not stopping until we were well away from the hospital. Only then did we collapse onto the ground, gasping for breath, our bodies shaking with adrenaline. I looked back at the hospital, now barely visible through the trees. The windows seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, as if the building itself was watching us leave. "We're never coming back here," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the fear still evident in his eyes. I nodded in agreement, knowing that whatever was in that hospital had let us go for now. But the memory of that night would stay with me forever, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk in forgotten places. It was the kind of job most people wouldn't take, but I didn't have the luxury of being picky. The factory had been shut down for years, its once bustling floors now silent and abandoned. But recently a new company had bought the place, planning to renovate and reopen it. My job was to be the night security guard, keeping an eye on the equipment that had already been moved in and making sure no one tried to break in. The factory was massive, an old brick building with towering smokestacks and broken windows. It sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and woods. At night, it was even more desolate. The only light came from the few bulbs strung along the perimeter fence, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. Doubt my shifts started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. I was given a small office near the front entrance with a desk, a chair, and a bank of security monitors. The monitors showed various angles of the factory's interior and exterior, all in grainy black and white. Most of the time, the screens were filled with nothing but empty hallways and deserted loading docks. It was boring, but easy money. The first few nights passed without incident. I spent my time reading, occasionally glancing at the monitors to make sure everything was as it should be. The silence was unnerving at first, but I got used to it. The building creaked and groaned as it settled. The wind howled through the broken windows, and once in a while a rat or a stray cat would scurry across the screen. It was lonely work, but I didn't mind. It was better than dealing with the noise and chaos of the day shift. But then things started to get strange. It began with little things, objects in the office that weren't where I remembered leaving them, doors that were closed when I knew I'd left them open. At first I chalked it up to forgetfulness or the wind playing tricks, but the occurrences became more frequent, more unsettling. One night, around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the desk, half asleep, when I noticed movement on one of the monitors. It was subtle, just a flicker in the corner of the screen, but it caught my attention. I sat up, squinting at the grainy image. The camera was pointed down a long hallway, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever in the dark. For a moment I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual shadows and debris. But then something moved again, a dark shape, barely visible, slipping out of sight around the corner. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned closer, watching the screen intently, but the shape didn't reappear. I quickly switched to the camera covering the area the figure had moved toward, but the screen showed only an empty hallway. I checked the other cameras, my pulse quickening, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. I sat back in my chair, trying to calm down. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself. The cameras were old, the footage grainy, and prone to glitches. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the less convinced I became the shape I'd seen wasn't a glitch. It had moved with purpose, like it was aware of the cameras and was deliberately staying out of sight. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. But nothing else happened, and by the time my shift ended, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. The next night, I was on edge from the start. I kept the lights on in the office, the bright fluorescence a small comfort in the darkness. I watched the monitors more closely, searching for any sign of movement, but the screens remained stubbornly empty. By midnight, I had almost relaxed, but then it happened again. This time, the figure appeared on a different camera and a different part of the factory. It was closer now, more distinct, a tall, shadowy figure, moving slowly down one of the old assembly lines. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as it glided silently through the shadows. It didn't look like any person I'd ever seen. There was something off about the way it moved, almost as if it was floating just above the ground. I switched to the next camera, tracking its progress, that once again it slipped out of sight before I could get a clear view. I cursed under my breath, switching frantically between cameras, but the figure was gone. I knew I should check it out, but the thought of leaving the relative safety of the office filled me with dread. I stared at the monitor, willing the figure to reappear, but the screen remained blank. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand. I couldn't just sit there all night, waiting for something to happen. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The air in the factory was cold, much colder than it should have been. My breath misted in front of me as I made my way through the darkened corridors, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. The place felt different, almost alive, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I walked slowly, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. The only noise was the echo of my footsteps on the concrete floor. I reached the assembly line where I had seen the figure, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary, just rows of old, rusting machinery and piles of dust-covered crates. I walked the length of the line, my nerves on edge, but nothing happened. I was starting to think I had imagined the whole thing when I heard a faint scraping sound coming from somewhere ahead of me. I froze, my flashlight flickering as I strained to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate scraping, like metal being dragged across the floor. My blood ran cold. I turned toward the noise, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I tried to steady my hand. The sound was coming from a large metal door at the far end of the assembly line, a door that led to the old storage area. It was ajar just slightly, and as I watched, it slowly swung open a few inches more. I wanted to run, to get the hell out of that factory and never come back, but something compelled me to move forward. My legs felt like lead as I approached the door, the scraping sound growing louder with each step. I reached out, pushing the door open with the barrel of my flashlight. The room beyond was pitch black, the darkness swallowing the light of my flashlight. The scraping sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there, my heart hammering in my chest, staring into the void. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel that something was in there with me, watching from the shadows. And then I saw them, two glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were unnaturally bright, like twin orbs of fire, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The eyes moved closer, and I could hear a low, rumbling growl emanating from the darkness. I turned and ran, my boots echoing in the silent factory as I fled down the corridor. I didn't stop until I was back in the office, slamming the door behind me and locking it with trembling hands. I backed away, panting, my eyes glued to the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But it didn't. The factory was silent again, the only sound my ragged breathing. I collapsed into the chair, my mind racing. I knew what I had seen, knew that there was something in that factory, something that shouldn't exist. But what was I supposed to do? I couldn't just leave, couldn't abandon my post. I needed the job, needed the money, but I also knew I couldn't stay. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and fear. I kept the door locked, the lights on, and watched the monitors with a desperate intensity, but the figure didn't reappear, and the glowing eyes stayed hidden in the darkness. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I drove home in a daze, barely aware of the road in front of me. When I got home, I called the company that had hired me and quit on the spot. I didn't give them a reason, just told them I couldn't do it anymore. They didn't ask for an explanation, and I didn't offer one. I didn't want to think about what I had seen, didn't want to acknowledge the reality of it, but I can't forget it. Even now, months later, the memory haunts me. I see those glowing eyes in my dreams, feel the oppressive darkness closing in around me. I know I made the right decision in leaving, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed, if I had gone back to that storage room, if I had confronted whatever was lurking in the shadows. I'll never know, and I don't want to. Some things are better left unknown, hidden in the darkness where they belong. But one thing is certain, I'll never set foot in that factory again. It was supposed to be a quiet night, the kind where you could finally unwind after a long week and let the weariness of the world fade away. My wife, Clara, and I had settled into our usual Friday night routine dinner, a movie, and then bed. It was nothing special, but it was our time, our way of connecting, after the hustle and bustle of life had kept us apart during the day. The house was still, almost unnervingly quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The silence was a rare luxury in our suburban neighborhood. I had always found it comforting, a sign that all was well in our little corner of the world. But that night, the silence was the prelude to something far darker. We had just finished watching the movie, a forgettable romantic comedy, and were getting ready for bed. Clara was in the bathroom brushing her teeth, and I was in the bedroom scrolling through my phone. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the bedside lamp and the faint light coming from the bathroom. That's when I heard a faint scratching sound, like something or someone trying to get in. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I strained to hear. At first I thought it might be a branch against the window or maybe a raccoon rummaging through the trash outside. But then the sound came again, more deliberate this time, and I knew it was coming from the front door. I set my phone down and got out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. I didn't want to alert Clara just yet. I didn't want to scare her if it turned out to be nothing. But as I approached the front door, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was unmistakably the sound of someone trying to pick the lock. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door just in case. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline surging through my veins. I stood there just a few feet from the door, listening as the intruder continued to work the lock. My mind raced, torn between calling the police or confronting whoever was on the other side. But then the sound stopped. There was a moment of eerie stillness, and I wondered if they had given up. Maybe they had realized we were home and decided to move on. But just as I began to relax, I heard the doorknob turn slowly, and my blood ran cold. The door creaked open just a crack, and I saw a gloved hand slip inside. Before I could react, the door was pushed open, and a figure stepped into the house. He was tall, wearing all black, with a ski mask covering his face. The only thing visible were his eyes, cold and calculating. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Time seemed to slow down, and all I could think about was Clara still in the bathroom. Blissfully unaware of the danger just a few feet away, I tightened my grip on the bat, my knuckles turning white, and prepared myself for what was to come. "Get out of my house," I growled, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The intruder didn't respond, didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, as if he were sizing me up. Then, without warning, he lunged at me. I swung the bat as hard as I could, aiming for his head, but he was too fast. He dodged the swing and grabbed the bat, yanking it out of my hands with terrifying strength. I stumbled backward, losing my balance, and fell to the floor. Before I could get up, he was on top of me, pinning me down with one hand, while the other reached into his pocket. I struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. I could see the glint of a knife in his hand as he pulled it out, and I knew I had only seconds to act. Desperation fueled my strength, and I managed to get one arm free, swinging it wildly at his face. My fist connected with his jaw, and he grunted in pain, momentarily loosening his grip. That was all the time I needed. I shoved him off of me and scrambled to my feet, running towards the bathroom where Clara was. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. "Daniel, what's going on?" Clara asked, her voice filled with fear. She could see the terror in my eyes, the way I was breathing hard, and she knew something was very wrong. "There's someone in the house," I whispered urgently. "We need to call the police." Clara's eyes widened in shock, but she didn't waste any time. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her hands trembling as she spoke to the operator. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any sound outside, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, just as Clara was giving the operator our address, there was a loud crash from the other side of the door. The intruder was trying to break in. I could see the doorknob rattling as he pounded on the door, each hit sending a jolt of fear through my body. "Please hurry," Clara pleaded with the operator, her voice on the verge of breaking. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy ceramic vase, and prepared to defend us. The door gave way, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. If he got through that door, we were done for. The pounding grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the door beginning to splinter under the force. The vase felt useless in my hands, but I held on to it anyway, determined to protect Clara no matter what. Then, just as it seemed the door would give way, the pounding stopped. There was a moment of silence, and I wondered if he had finally given up, but I didn't dare let my guard down. I could still feel his presence on the other side, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence stretched on, the tension in the room so thick I could barely breathe. I could see the fear in Clara's eyes, and I knew she saw the same in mine. We were trapped, cornered like animals, with no way out, and then we heard a sound that sent chills down my spine. It was the sound of footsteps, not coming towards the door, but moving away. The intruder was leaving. I waited, listening as the footsteps grew fainter, until finally they were gone. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just stood there, holding our breath, waiting for anything to happen. But the house was silent once more. The only sound, the faint hum of the bathroom fan, Clara slowly lowered her phone, her hands still shaking. "The police are on their way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my body still tense, every muscle ready to spring into action at the slightest sound. But there was nothing, no more footsteps, no more pounding. It was as if the intruder had vanished into thin air. We stayed in the bathroom until the police arrived, too afraid to leave the safety of that small, locked room. When the officers finally did arrive, they searched the house from top to bottom, but found no sign of the intruder, no fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The terror of that night was real, and it haunted me long after the police left. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to strike. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent me into a state of panic. I installed new locks, security cameras, anything I could think of to make the house feel safe again. But the truth was, the sense of safety we had once taken for granted was gone, shattered by the intruder who had broken more than just our door that night. He had broken our peace of mind, and that was something no lock or camera could ever restore. Moving into the old farmhouse seemed like a dream come true. The property was nestled in a quiet corner of the countryside, surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods. The house itself was charming, with its wraparound porch, white picket fence, and the sweet scent of lilacs blooming in the garden. For someone like me, who had grown tired of the noise and chaos of city life, it was the perfect escape. I had always wanted to live in a place where I could hear the birds singing in the morning, where the air was clean and fresh, where I could feel a sense of peace that had been missing from my life for so long. I didn't mind that the house was old or that it needed some work. In fact, that was part of the appeal. I looked forward to spending my weekends fixing it up, making it my own. The first few weeks were blissful. I spent my days unpacking, painting, and tending to the garden. The neighbors, though few and far between, were friendly, waving as they passed by on the country road. It felt like I had stepped back in time to a simpler, more peaceful era. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice things small, almost imperceptible at first, but they began to gnaw at me. It started with the lilacs. They were beautiful, their fragrance filling the air around the house, but no matter how many I cut to bring inside, they never seemed to diminish. It was as if the bushes were constantly in bloom, never wilting, never fading. I tried not to think too much of it, chalking it up to the wonders of nature. But then there were the noises, or rather the lack of them. The house was too quiet, eerily so. In a place like this, you'd expect to hear the creaks and groans of an old house settling, the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees, or the distant calls of animals. But there was nothing. The silence was so profound that it felt oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. At night, the silence became even more unsettling. I would lie in bed, straining to hear something, anything, but the only sound was my own heartbeat, loud and insistent in my ears. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist the moment the sun went down. And then there were the dreams. They started innocuously enough, vague, hazy images that would fade as soon as I woke up, but over time they became more vivid, more disturbing. I dreamed of the house, but it wasn't the house as it was. It was dark, decaying, filled with shadows that seemed to move on their own. In the dreams, I would walk through the halls, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. I would hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, just at the edge of my hearing. And always there was the scent of lilacs, stronger than ever, almost suffocating in its sweetness. One night I woke up in a cold sweat, the scent of lilacs so strong that it made my stomach turn. I sat up in bed, trying to shake off the lingering fear from the dream. But the scent didn't dissipate. It hung in the air, thick and cloying. I got up, hoping that some fresh air would clear my head. As I stepped out onto the porch, the night was still and silent, as usual, but something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something unseen watching me. I walked down the steps and into the garden, drawn toward the lilac bushes. The scent was overwhelming now, almost nauseating. As I reached out to touch one of the blossoms, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering my name. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, closer. I turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, every light in the house on, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I called my friend, Karen, who was a real estate agent. I told her about the strange occurrences, expecting her to laugh it off or tell me I was just letting the isolation get to me. But instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, hesitant. She told me that the house had a history, one that she hadn't mentioned when I bought it because she didn't want to scare me off. Apparently, the previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret, had lived there alone for many years. She was known in the area for her beautiful lilacs, which she tended to with almost obsessive care. But she was also known for her reclusiveness. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she was seen talking to herself, as if she was carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. One day, she simply vanished. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but they never found a trace of her. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. After Margaret's disappearance, the house sat empty for years. No one wanted to buy it, not because of the condition of the property, but because of the stories that started to circulate. People claimed that they could hear her voice, whispering in the wind, and that the scent of lilacs would grow stronger whenever they got close to the house. I listened to Karen's story in stunned silence, my mind racing. It all made sense now, the lilacs that never seemed to fade, the silence, the whispers in the night. I realized then that I wasn't alone in the house. Margaret was still there, tending to her beloved lilacs, trapped between this world and the next. I knew I had to leave. I packed up my things, moving as fast as I could, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. As I loaded the last of my boxes into the car, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Standing by the lilac bushes was a figure barely visible in the morning light. It was a woman, her features obscured by the shadows. But I knew it was Margaret. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. I didn't wait to see what she would do. I got in my car and drove away, not looking back until I was miles down the road. When I finally did glance in the rearview mirror, the house was just a dot on the horizon, and the scent of lilacs was fading, replaced by the crisp, clean air of the open road. I never went back to that house. I couldn't, even if I had wanted to. It wasn't mine anymore. It was Margaret's, and I had no right to disturb her peace. The lilacs would continue to bloom year after year, their scent a reminder of the woman who had loved them so much that she could never truly leave them behind. Working the night shift in a small-town hospital is a job that offers both a sense of peace and an unsettling isolation. The long, quiet hours are often punctuated by the steady hum of machines and the occasional ring of a call bell. I had grown accustomed to the routine, the stillness that enveloped the place after dark. The hospital was an old building, its halls lined with memories of years gone by, and while it had its share of eerie moments, nothing had ever truly disturbed me. That was until one particular night, when the routine was broken in a way that I could never have anticipated. It was a Thursday night, just like any other. I arrived at the hospital just before 11 p.m., exchanging pleasantries with the day shift as they hurriedly gathered their belongings, eager to leave. The night shift team was small, just me, a few nurses, and a security guard who spent most of his time in the small office near the entrance. We knew each other well, having spent countless nights together, and we had our own unspoken rhythm. The patients were usually few, often elderly people who required constant monitoring, but little in the way of active care. It was a quiet night, and I expected it to stay that way. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the nurse's station, going over some charts, when I heard the distinctive sound of footsteps in the hallway. This wasn't unusual. Patients sometimes wandered, disoriented in the night, and it was our job to gently guide them back to bed. I looked up, expecting to see one of our regulars making their way down the hall, but the corridor was empty. I waited, listening for the sound again, but it didn't come. Shrugging it off, I returned to my paperwork, figuring that my mind was playing tricks on me. A few minutes later, the sound came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere down the hall. I stood up, peering into the dimly lit corridor, but again there was no one there. A sense of unease began to settle in my stomach, but I tried to push it aside. Maybe someone was up and about and had just moved out of sight. I decided to check the rooms just to be sure. As I made my rounds, I found each patient sound asleep in their beds. The night was still, the only sound the soft beeping of monitors, but the feeling that something was off lingered, and I found myself moving quickly, eager to get back to the safety of the nurse's station. When I reached the end of the hall, I glanced back, half expecting to see something or someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty corridor stretching out before me. Back at the station, I settled into my chair, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was just a slow night, that my mind was filling the silence with imagined noises, but deep down I knew it was more than that. The hospital had always felt old, like it carried the weight of every life that had passed through its doors. Tonight it felt even heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. It was just after 3 a.m. when the call bell rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sudden sound, my heart racing as I grabbed the clipboard and headed towards the room where the light was blinking. Room 317. An elderly woman who had been admitted earlier that week with pneumonia. She was one of our more stable patients, and I hadn't expected her to need anything during the night. But when I entered the room, I found her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and fearful. "What's wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice calm as I approached her bedside. She looked at me, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket to her chest. "There's someone in here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A chill ran down my spine. "There's no one here but us," I said, glancing around the room. It was empty, just as I had expected, but she shook her head, her eyes darting to the corner of the room. I saw him. He was standing right there, watching me. I turned to look where she was pointing, my skin prickling as I did. The corner was dark, the shadows deep, but there was nothing there. I tried to reassure her, telling her that it was just a dream, that she was safe, but her fear was contagious. I could feel it creeping into my own thoughts, making me question, what I had heard and seen earlier. I stayed with her until she calmed down, her breathing evening out as she finally drifted back to sleep. But as I left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those footsteps I had heard earlier weren't a figment of my imagination. I hurried back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding in my chest. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't focus, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing up, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but there was never anyone there. The hospital, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt foreign and hostile, as if it was hiding something in its shadows. When the morning shift arrived, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I handed over the charts, eager to leave and put the night behind me. As I walked to my car, the sun just beginning to rise, I told myself that it had all been in my head, that the long hours and isolation had gotten to me. But as I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of the old woman's terrified face, or the sound of those footsteps echoing in the empty hall. I didn't talk about what happened that night, not to my coworkers or anyone else. I didn't want to seem irrational, didn't want to admit that something had shaken me so deeply. But every time I went back to the hospital, I found myself on edge, waiting for something to happen, listening for those footsteps in the night. The routine was broken, and I knew that it would never feel the same again. That was the last time I worked the night shift. I asked to be moved 2 days, citing health reasons, and thankfully they agreed. I couldn't bring myself to stay in that building after dark anymore. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that the hospital, with its long history and quiet halls, holds secrets that are better left undisturbed, and some things once broken can never be fixed. I never thought something like this would happen to me. Not in my own home, not in the middle of the night. I had always felt safe where I lived. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people waved to each other from their front porches, where kids played in the streets until the street lights came on. It wasn't the kind of place where you worried about locking your doors or looking over your shoulder when you walked to your car. But that all changed on a night I will never forget. I had just settled into bed after a long day at work. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that usually helped me drift off to sleep quickly. But for some reason that night I couldn't relax. I tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but something just didn't feel right. I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like something was off, that I couldn't put my finger on it. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a faint sound coming from the back of the house. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a raccoon in the trash cans or the wind rustling the trees outside. But then I heard it again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards just outside my bedroom door. My heart started racing. I knew I had locked the doors before going to bed. I always did. I was careful about that, living alone and all, but this sound was unmistakable. Someone was in my house. I froze, straining to listen, hoping I was wrong. But then I heard it again, closer now, like someone was moving slowly down the hallway, trying not to make any noise, but failing. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the nightstand, but it felt like it was a million miles away. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound, terrified that whoever was out there would hear me. Then I heard the door handle turn, ever so slowly. It was the softest sound, but in that moment it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The door creaked open just a crack, and I could see the outline of a figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in darkness. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, praying that they would leave. that they would think the room was empty and move on. But they didn't. Instead, they stepped into the room, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The figure moved slowly, deliberately towards my bed. I could barely make out their features in the dark, just the shadow of a person creeping closer and closer. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, so loud I was sure they could hear it. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my own bed as this intruder loomed over me. They stopped at the foot of the bed, just standing there, watching me. I didn't know what they wanted, what they were planning to do. All I knew was that I was alone in the house, with no one to help me, and this stranger was only a few feet away. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I lay there, waiting for them to make their move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind them. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until I heard the sound of the front door opening and closing softly, the intruder finally leaving my house. I waited a few minutes before I dared to move. When I was sure they were gone, I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived quickly, but by the time they got there, the intruder was long gone. They found signs of forced entry on the back door, but nothing else was taken. Nothing else disturbed. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure: I'll never feel safe in my own home again. I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years, crisscrossing the country on highways that stretch for miles, cutting through lonely deserts and winding through dense forests. I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, things that would make most people question their sanity. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened one stormy night on Highway 99, a stretch of road that has a reputation among truckers as being different. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. I had just finished a delivery in Bakersfield and was on my way up north to Sacramento. The weather was rough, rain pouring down in sheets, the kind of rain that makes the road slick and treacherous. Visibility was poor, with my headlights barely cutting through the darkness, but I had a deadline to meet, so I kept my rig moving, the hum of the engine steady against the backdrop of the storm. Highway 99 is a long, desolate road at night, especially in the middle of a storm. The only company you have are the occasional headlights of another truck passing by, but even those were few and far between that night. I had the radio on low, more for the comfort of background noise than anything else. It was just me, my rig, and the road ahead, or so I thought. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. The air inside the cab felt different, heavy, almost suffocating. The rain outside seemed to intensify, pounding against the windshield like a relentless drumbeat. I could barely see the road, and the wipers struggled to keep up. But it wasn't just the weather that was unsettling me. There was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I had driven this route countless times before, but that night it felt as if the highway was leading me somewhere I wasn't meant to go. The road ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, like a black ribbon disappearing into the void. I felt a gnawing sense of unease, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as if I were being watched. That's when I saw it up ahead in the distance, barely visible through the rain, a figure standing by the side of the road, drenched and shivering, with an arm outstretched, trying to flag me down. At first I thought it was just another stranded motorist, someone whose car had broken down in the storm. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure was a woman. dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, the kind you'd see in movies set in the 1950s or 60s. Her hair was plastered to her face from the rain, and her skin was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. But it was her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. Why, unblinking and filled with an expression of utter despair. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was out of habit, or maybe I just didn't want to leave someone out in the storm. But I slowed the truck down and pulled over a few feet ahead of where she was standing. I turned on the hazard lights and waited for her to approach, but she didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. I rolled down the passenger window a crack, letting in the cold, damp air. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even blink. She just stood there, like a statue. As the rain poured down around her, a sense of dread settled over me, and I started to regret stopping. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like I had just made a terrible mistake. But before I could drive off, the woman suddenly moved. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and then she was at the side of the truck, her hand resting on the door handle. I watched, frozen, as she opened the door and climbed into the cab. She didn't say a word, didn't even look at me as she settled into the passenger seat. Her dress was soaked, water dripping onto the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. I glanced over at her, and that's when I saw the small pool of water forming around her feet, except it wasn't just water. It was tinged with red, like diluted blood. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Who was this woman? What had happened to her? I wanted to ask, to say something, but my mouth was dry and my throat felt tight. All I could do was stare ahead at the road, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. "Where are you headed?" I finally managed to ask, my voice shaky. "Home," she whispered, her voice so soft I could barely hear it over the sound of the rain. "I just want to go home." There was something in the way she said it that made my skin crawl, like she wasn't talking about a place, but something far more ominous. I kept my eyes on the road, the truck moving forward at a steady pace, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving towards something terrible. The storm raged on outside, the rain coming down harder than ever. The road was nearly invisible, a blur of wet asphalt and flashing headlights. I tried to focus, to push the growing fear out of my mind, but it was no use. Every time I glanced over at the woman, she was just sitting there, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped in her lap. Then, without warning, the radio crackled to life, blasting static through the speakers. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The woman didn't react, didn't even flinch. I reached for the dial to turn it down, but as I did, the static cleared, and a voice came through, a voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "A severe accident reported on Highway 99. A car overturned in the storm. Emergency services are on the scene. Motorists are advised to avoid the area." The voice faded back into static, and I sat there, my mind racing. An accident on Highway 99. My thoughts flashed back to the woman sitting next to me. Could she have been involved? Was she a survivor? But if that were the case, why wasn't she hurt? Why was there no sign of a car or wreckage when I picked her up? The questions swirled in my mind, but I didn't dare ask them aloud. Instead, I focused on the road, praying that I would find an exit soon, somewhere to pull over and let this woman out of my truck. But as the minutes ticked by, the road stretched on with no sign of an exit, no sign of anything except the relentless storm. The woman remained silent, her presence a heavy weight in the cab. I could feel her watching me, even though she hadn't turned her head. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know who she was, what had happened to her. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, the woman turned to me, her eyes locking on to mine. "You can't save me," she whispered, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through the air like a knife. I stared at her, my breath catching in my throat. There was something about her eyes, something ancient, something that had seen more than any human ever should. I felt a chill run down my spine, and suddenly I knew. I knew that this woman wasn't from this world, that she was something else entirely. "I'm sorry," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand." She didn't respond, just turned back to face the road. And then, without warning, she was gone. One moment she was there, and the next, the seat was empty. The cab was cold, colder than it had been before, and the only sound was the rain hammering against the windshield. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt in the middle of the highway. My heart was racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I looked around, half expecting to see her standing by the side of the road again, but there was nothing, just the rain, the darkness, and the empty road ahead. For a long moment, I sat there, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what to think. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and that stretch of highway as possible. I shifted the truck into gear and drove, my foot pressing down hard on the accelerator. The storm raged on, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away, to leave whatever had happened behind me. It wasn't until hours later, when I finally pulled into a truck stop near Sacramento, that I allowed myself to breathe. I parked the rig and sat there, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced, but I also knew that no one would believe me. Who would believe a story like that? I never took that route again. I avoided Highway 99 like the plague, choosing longer routes just to stay away from it. But no matter how far I drove, I could never shake the memory of that night, the memory of the woman who appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Even now, all these years later, I still think about her. I wonder who she was, what her story was. But some questions are better left unanswered, and some roads are better left untraveled. It was supposed to be just another day, another routine visit to the hospital where I worked as a nurse in the psychiatric ward. The ward was never quiet, always filled with the sounds of patients, some lost in their own worlds, others crying out for help that the medications couldn't seem to provide. But that day, as soon as I walked through the doors, I felt something was different. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The shift started like any other. I checked in with the other nurses, got my assignments for the day, and began making my rounds. Most of the patients were the same ones I had been caring for over the past few months. But there was a new name on the list, someone who'd been brought in the night before, James Hall, a man in his late 30s who had been found wandering the streets, disoriented and talking to himself. The police had brought him in after he had been seen smashing his head against a wall, repeatedly muttering words no one could understand. When I entered his room, I found him sitting in the corner, his knees pulled up to his chest, rocking back and forth. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if he was searching for something or someone. His hands were clenched into tight fists, his knuckles white from the pressure. "James," I called softly, not wanting to startle him. He didn't respond, just kept rocking and muttering under his breath. I approached him slowly, trying to get a better look at him. His clothes were torn and dirty, and there were deep scratches on his arms, as if he had been clawing at his own skin. "James, can you hear me?" I asked again, this time reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my hand made contact with his skin, he froze. The muttering stopped, and he slowly lifted his head to look at me, his eyes. I'll never forget his eyes. They were dark, almost black, and there was something in them that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just fear or pain, it was something deeper, something that shouldn't have been there. For a moment, I felt like I was staring into a void, the bottomless pit of darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. Suddenly, he grabbed my wrist with a strength that didn't seem possible for someone in his state. His grip was like a vice, and I could feel his nails digging into my skin. "Get out," he hissed, his voice low and guttural, nothing like the muttering I had heard before. "Get out before it takes you too." I pulled my hand back, breaking free of his grip, and stumbled back a few steps. He didn't move, didn't say anything else, just kept staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, my heart racing. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself that it was just another case, just another patient suffering from a severe mental illness, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Over the next few days, James's condition worsened. He refused to eat or sleep, spent most of his time staring at the walls or talking to something that wasn't there. The other nurses were scared of him, and I couldn't blame them. There was something about him, something that made everyone uneasy, something that felt wrong. One night I was working the late shift, and I was assigned to check on him. The halls were quiet, the other patients were asleep, and I could hear the faint sound of James's voice echoing down the corridor as I approached his room. When I opened the door, I found him standing in the middle of the room, his back to me, his arms hanging limply at his sides. But instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, hesitant. She told me that the house had a history, one that she hadn't mentioned when I bought it because she didn't want to scare me off. Apparently, the previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret, had lived there alone for many years. She was known in the area for her beautiful lilacs, which she tended to with almost obsessive care. But she was also known for her reclusiveness. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she was seen talking to herself, as if she was carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. One day, she simply vanished. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but they never found a trace of her. It was as if she had disappeared into thin air. After Margaret's disappearance, the house sat empty for years. No one wanted to buy it, not because of the condition of the property, but because of the stories that started to circulate. People claimed that they could hear her voice, whispering in the wind, and that the scent of lilacs would grow stronger whenever they got close to the house. I listened to Corinne's story in stunned silence, my mind racing. It all made sense now, the lilacs that never seemed to fade, the silence, the whispers in the night. I realized then that I wasn't alone in the house. Margaret was still there, tending to her beloved lilacs, trapped between this world and the next. I knew I had to leave. I packed up my things, moving as fast as I could, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. As I loaded the last of my boxes into the car, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Standing by the lilac bushes was a figure barely visible in the morning light. It was a woman, her features obscured by the shadows. But I knew it was Margaret. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. I didn't wait to see what she would do. I got in my car and drove away, not looking back until I was miles down the road. When I finally did glance in the rearview mirror, the house was just a dot on the horizon, and the scent of lilacs was fading, replaced by the crisp, clean air of the open road. I never went back to that house. I couldn't, even if I had wanted to. It wasn't mine anymore. It was Margaret's, and I had no right to disturb her peace. The lilacs would continue to bloom year after year, their scent a reminder of the woman who had loved them so much that she could never truly leave them behind. I've been a trucker for almost 2 decades, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. The long hours, the endless highways, the isolation, it all plays tricks on your mind after a while. But there's one night that stands out above all the rest, a night I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. It was the night I took a detour that led me down a road I should have never traveled. It was a cold November night, and I was hauling a load of lumber from a mill in Oregon to a construction site in Idaho. The route was familiar, one I'd driven many times before. I had planned to stop at a rest area just off the highway to grab a few hours of sleep before continuing the journey. But as I neared my usual stop, I saw that the exit was closed for construction. Frustrated, but not overly concerned, I pulled out my map and found an alternate route that would take me around the construction and back onto the highway a few miles further down. The detour was a small 2-lane road that wound its way through dense forest. It was isolated, to say the least, and the only light came from my truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. The road was narrow and twisting, and I had to slow down to navigate the sharp turns. The trees closed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that made it feel like I was driving through a tunnel. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and I hadn't seen another vehicle since I'd turned off the highway. The forest around me was silent, no animals darting across the road, no birds calling in the night, just the steady rumble of my truck and the occasional creak of the trailer as I maneuvered the tight curves. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road up ahead. At first I thought it was a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, I realized something wasn't right. The figure was tall and thin, with long, stringy hair that hung down over its face. It was dressed in tattered clothing that looked more like rags, and it stood unnaturally still, its head turned slightly as if watching me. I slowed down, my heart pounding as I passed by. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the truck's lights or the sound of the engine. It just stood there, like a statue. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look back in the rearview mirror, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and unnerving. A few miles down the road, I began to notice other figures standing along the roadside. Each one was similar to the first, tall, thin, and eerily still. They appeared at irregular intervals, always alone, always watching. I couldn't make out any details of their faces, just the dark, featureless shapes against the backdrop of the trees. My unease grew with each passing mile, the road ahead seeming to stretch on endlessly, as if I was driving into some kind of nightmare. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the figures were probably just shadows or tricks of the light. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I'd driven through remote areas before, but I'd never felt anything like this, a suffocating sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a sign indicating that the highway was just a few miles ahead. Relief washed over me, and I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to leave that strange, isolated road behind. But just as I began to relax, something darted out of the trees and into the road ahead. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. My heart was in my throat as I stared at the figure in the road. It was one of them, the same tall, thin shape, standing directly in my path. This time I could see its face, or rather the lack of one. The face was smooth, featureless, like a blank mask, and it tilted its head slightly as if studying me. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't move, didn't make any attempt to get out of the way. It just stood there, blocking the road, as if daring me to continue. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. There was no way around it. The road was too narrow, and the trees too close. I couldn't reverse. The road behind me was winding and treacherous. The only option was to go forward, but every instinct screamed at me not to. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked back into the woods. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. As soon as it disappeared into the trees, I slammed my foot on the gas and tore down the road. Not daring to look back, I made it back to the highway in record time, the familiar lights of passing cars and road signs a welcome sight. But even as I left that strange road behind, the sense of dread lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. I didn't stop at the rest area. I kept driving until I reached the next town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. When I finally pulled into a truck stop and turned off the engine, I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't know what I had seen on that road, and I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I would never take that route again. No matter what. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize the experience, telling myself that it had all been a trick of the mind, that the figures I'd seen were just figments of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something on that road, something that didn't belong in this world, and I had been lucky to escape it. I continued to drive trucks for a few more years, but I was never the same. The open road, once a place of freedom and adventure, now held a sense of danger that I couldn't shake. Every time I passed a dark, wooded stretch of highway, I found myself gripping the wheel a little tighter, my eyes scanning the roadside for any sign of those strange figures. Eventually, I retired from trucking, trading in the long hauls and lonely nights for a quieter life. But even now, all these years later, I can't drive down a dark road without thinking of that night. The road less traveled, they say, can lead to unexpected destinations. But sometimes those destinations are better left unexplored. Working the night shift in a hospital can do strange things to your mind. The long hours, the dim lighting, the constant hum of machines, it's enough to make anyone feel a little off. But at St. Mary's Hospital, there was something more than just the usual night shift weariness, something that gnawed at the edges of your sanity, making you question what was real and what was just your imagination playing tricks on you. I had been working as a nurse at St. Mary's for about 6 months when I first started noticing the strange occurrences. The hospital was old, one of those grand, imposing structures built in the early 1900s with high ceilings and long, echoing hallways. It had a history, one that the staff didn't talk about much, but the rumors were always there, lurking in the background, like a bad smell you couldn't quite get rid of. The night shift was always quiet, with fewer patients and a skeleton crew of nurses and doctors. The silence was only broken by the occasional beeping of monitors or the soft murmur of voices at the nurses' station. But it was during these quiet hours that things started to happen, things that couldn't be explained by the rational mind. I remember the first time I experienced it. It was around 3 a.m., the dead of night, when the hospital was at its most still. I was doing my rounds on the 4th floor, the psychiatric ward, where the most troubled patients were kept. It was always a bit eerie up there, with the heavy doors and the constant feeling of being watched. But that night something felt different. I was checking on Mrs. Delaney, an elderly woman who had been admitted for severe depression. She was in her late 70s, frail and withdrawn, and spent most of her time staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. When I entered her room, she was lying in bed, her eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling. Double quotes Mrs. Delaney. I whispered, not wanting to startle her. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. I stepped closer, thinking she might have fallen asleep with her eyes open, something I had seen before, but as I reached her bedside, she suddenly turned her head towards me, her eyes locking onto mine. "They're here," she said in a voice that was barely audible, a rasping whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Who's here?" "Mrs. Delaney," I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer, just kept staring at me with those wide, unblinking eyes. I checked her vitals. Everything was normal. No fever, no signs of distress, but something about the way she looked at me made my skin crawl. I finished my checks as quickly as I could and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The lights seemed dimmer, the shadows longer, and the silence was oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many long nights and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. About the next night, it happened again. I was in the same ward, doing my rounds at the same time. As I approached Mrs. Delaney's room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, the soft glow of the night light spilling out into the hallway. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. She was sitting up in bed this time, her back to the door, staring out the window. The room was freezing, colder than the rest of the hospital, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I stepped inside, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. "Mrs. Delaney?" I called out softly. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I walked around the bed to face her, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Her face was a mask of terror, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. She was clutching the bed sheet so tightly that her knuckles were white. But it wasn't just her expression that terrified me, it was what she was looking at. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure, a dark silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long arms that seemed to stretch towards Mrs. Delaney. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and malevolent. I blinked, and the figure was gone, just like that, as if it had never been there. But the terror on Mrs. Delaney's face remained frozen in place. I rushed to her side, checking her pulse, but it was too late. She was gone, her body cold and lifeless. I backed away from the bed, my hands trembling. I had seen death before plenty of times, but this was different. This felt wrong, like something had taken her, something that didn't belong in this world. I reported her death to the attending physician, but I didn't mention what I had seen. I knew they wouldn't believe me, would chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. But I knew the truth. I had seen it with my own eyes. After that night, things got worse. The strange occurrences became more frequent, more intense. Lights would flicker, doors would slam shut on their own, and we would hear voices, soft, whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Patients started complaining of nightmares, of seeing things in the shadows. One woman, a young mother admitted for postpartum depression, claimed that something was visiting her at night, something that whispered to her, promising to take her pain away. She was found the next morning, her wrist slit, a look of peace on her face that was more disturbing than any scream. The other nurses and I began to avoid the 4th floor whenever we could, only going up there when absolutely necessary. But even then, we couldn't escape the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started having nightmares vivid, terrifying dreams where I was trapped in the hospital, running through endless hallways that twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the darkness. I could hear the whispers in my dreams, too, growing louder and more insistent, until they were all I could hear. The breaking point came one night when I was alone in the nurse's station, catching up on paperwork. The hospital was quiet. The only sound the soft hum of the machines. I had just finished a particularly tedious report when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere down the hall. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, primal and menacing. I slowly got up from my chair, my hands trembling, and walked towards the hallway. The lights flickered as I stepped out, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The growling grew louder, closer, until it was right in front of me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the same figure I had seen in Mrs. Delaney's room. But this time it was clearer, more defined. It was tall, its limbs impossibly long, its body twisted and contorted. Its face was a grotesque mask of flesh and bone, with empty sockets where its eyes should have been. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure slowly raised one hand, pointing directly at me. The growling stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling laugh that echoed through the hallway, reverberating off the walls. And then it lunged. I don't remember what happened next. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor of the nurse's station, my colleagues standing over me, their faces etched with concern. They told me they had found me unconscious, that I must have fainted. But I knew the truth. I quit my job at St. Mary's the next day. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had seen, what I had experienced. The hospital was haunted, cursed, whatever you wanted to call it. There was something evil in that place, something that fed on the fear and despair of the patients and staff. I've tried to move on, to put the memories behind me, but the nightmares still come. I can still hear the whispers, the low, guttural growl that haunts my dreams. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I can feel it watching me, waiting for the moment when it will come for me again. The sky was beginning to darken as I drove down the winding roads that led to the remote Michigan woods. I had been traveling for hours, the GPS signal fading in and out as I ventured deeper into the wilderness. My destination was a small, forgotten trail that only a handful of locals seemed to know about. I had heard whispers of it in online forums, places where enthusiasts of the unexplained gathered to share stories of encounters with creatures that shouldn't exist. The trail, they said, was home to something sinister, something that had been sighted by hunters, hikers, and those unlucky enough to stray too far off the beaten path. I was drawn to these stories like a moth to a flame, always seeking out the truth behind the legends. It was why I had spent so many nights camping alone in the woods, why I had driven hundreds of miles to chase down leads that others dismissed as mere folklore. But nothing had prepared me for what I was about to experience. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the sun had almost completely set, casting long shadows through the dense forest. I parked my car and gathered my gear, a flashlight, a camera, and a small knife for protection. I hesitated for a moment, the warnings from the forums echoing in my mind. Turn back before it finds you, one post had read. Another had simply said, don't go alone, but I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself that they were just stories, exaggerated tales meant to scare away the curious. I had come too far to turn back now. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches forming a tangled canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle of something unseen in the underbrush. After about an hour of walking, I reached a clearing where the trees thinned out, revealing a small pond surrounded by tall grasses. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. I took a moment to catch my breath, the quiet of the forest unsettling in its intensity. That's when I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to hear it again. The growl came again, this time closer, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a coyote or a stray dog, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The growl had sounded wrong, like something that didn't belong in this world. I started to back away, my instincts screaming at me to run. But then I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the clearing. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal, and they seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped out of the shadows, revealing a creature that defied explanation. It stood on two legs, towering over me, its body covered in thick, matted fur that was black as midnight. Its head was that of a dog or a wolf, but distorted, its snout elongated and filled with sharp, glistening teeth. The eyes, those terrible eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of fear unlike anything I had ever experienced. The creature growled again, a sound that reverberated through the trees, and began to move toward me, its movements eerily smooth and deliberate. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to get away, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around me had become thick, trapping me in place. The distance between us closed in an instant, and before I could react, the creature lunged at me, its jaws snapping shut inches from my face. Somehow I managed to stumble backward, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. The impact jolted me back to reality, and I scrambled to my feet. Adrenaline pumping through my veins, I ran, tearing through the forest with no regard for the branches that scratched at my face and arms. The growls followed me, closer and closer, until I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I had to get back to the car, back to safety, but the trail had vanished in the darkness, leaving me lost in a maze of trees. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst into another clearing, this one much larger, with the faint outline of the trailhead visible in the distance. I sprinted toward it, my legs threatening to give out with every step. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me, its growls turning into a chilling howl that echoed through the night. I reached the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could feel the creature's presence just beyond the tree line, watching me, waiting. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it. I didn't waste any time starting the engine and peeling out of there, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the road. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the creature chasing after me, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the forest silent once more. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the adrenaline still coursing through me, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just encountered. I never went back to that trail, never spoke of what happened to anyone, but the memory of those glowing eyes, that twisted, monstrous face, haunts me to this day. I've heard stories of the dogman of Michigan, a creature that's said to roam the woods, hunting those who dare to cross its path. I used to think they were just that, stories, nothing more, but now I know the truth. The dogman is real, and it's out there, waiting in the darkness. There's something uniquely unsettling about the quiet of your own home at night. The familiar sounds, creaking floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator take on a different tone. When you're alone, the darkness making every noise seem sharper, more intrusive. But for me, that night, it wasn't just the usual nighttime sounds that kept me awake. It was something else, something that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. I had just moved into my first home, a modest single-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. I had spent weeks painting, furnishing, and decorating, making the place feel like my own. By the time I finally moved in, it was late autumn, the days growing shorter, and the nights colder. That night was no different from any other. I had spent the evening unpacking the last of my boxes and setting up my home office. By the time I was finished, it was nearly midnight, and I was exhausted. I locked up the house, double-checking the windows and doors, and headed to bed. As I lay in bed, the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague sense of unease, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just the stress of the move and the unfamiliarity of the new place. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by a sound of soft, almost imperceptible noise that seemed to come from somewhere inside the house. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear it again. But the house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the knitstand. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or the wind outside. But as I tried to drift back to sleep, I heard it again, a faint creak, like the sound of a floorboard under pressure. This time I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Someone was inside the house. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. I had locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. But the sound was unmistakable, growing louder as it moved through the house. Someone or something was walking through the hallway, and they were getting closer to my bedroom. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my ears. My first thought was to grab something to defend myself with, but I realized I had nothing, no bat, no knife, nothing that could serve as a weapon. Panic started to set in, and I had to force myself to stay calm. I crept towards the bedroom door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the door. I could see the shadow of someone moving under the crack at the bottom of the door. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside. I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall, trying to steady my shaking hands. The doorknob turned slowly, the metal squeaking in the stillness of the night. The door opened a crack, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness on the other side. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts and fears running through my head. Who was it? What did they want? How did they get in? But before I could process any of it, the door opened wider, and a figure stepped into the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by the shadows. They stood there for a moment, not moving, just staring into the room. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel their gaze, cold and calculating, scanning the room. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. My mind was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, cornered in my own bedroom, with nowhere to go. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, their footfall heavy on the wooden floor. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and I moved, darting towards the closet in the corner of the room. I threw myself inside, closing the door just as the figure reached the side of the bed. I held my breath, trying to quiet the sound of my pounding heart. The closet was small, cramped, and I could feel the walls pressing in on me, but it was the only place I could think to hide. I could hear the figure moving around the room, their footsteps slow and deliberate, as if they were searching for something. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The figure was methodical, opening drawers, moving furniture, their movements unnervingly calm. I could hear them breathing, a low, steady sound that sent shivers down my spine. I was terrified they would find me, that they would open the closet door and discover me cowering inside. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps ceased, the breathing quieted. I waited, my entire body tense, expecting the worst. But there was nothing, just silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. But eventually I had to know, I had to see if they were gone. Slowly I reached for the closet door, my hand trembling as I grasped the handle. I pushed it open a fraction of an inch, peering out into the room. It was empty. The figure was gone. I stepped out of the closet, my legs shaking, barely able to support my weight. I couldn't believe what had just happened. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of it all. Who had been in my house? Why hadn't they taken anything? Why had they just left? I moved through the house, turning on every light as I went, checking every room, every corner. But there was no sign of the intruder, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The doors and windows were all still locked, and nothing appeared to be out of place. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Someone had been in my house that night. Someone had walked through the hallways, entered my bedroom, and searched through my belongings, and then they had just disappeared. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the living room, every light in the house on, clutching my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I waited for the dawn, praying that the figure wouldn't return. When morning finally came, I called the police. They arrived within minutes, two officers who took my statement and searched the house from top to bottom. They didn't find anything, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing that could explain what had happened. They assured me that I was safe, that it was probably just a bad dream or a case of nerves from the move. But I knew better. I knew what I had experienced was real, and it wasn't something as simple as a bad dream. Someone had been in my house that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they would be back. I didn't stay in that house much longer. I couldn't. Every night I would lie awake, listening for the sound of footsteps, waiting for the intruder to return. The fear consumed me, making it impossible to feel safe in my own home. Eventually I sold the house and moved back in with my parents. It felt like a step backward, but I didn't care. I just wanted to feel safe again, to sleep without fear. But even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. I still hear the soft creak of footsteps in the dark, the turn of the doorknob, the figure standing in my bedroom. And every time I hear those sounds in my dreams, I'm reminded of one terrifying truth. You can lock the doors, you can lock the windows, but you're never truly safe. Because sometimes the things that go bump in the night aren't just in your imagination. Sometimes they're real. For as long as I can remember, I've been a man of the mountains. The Appalachian Trail has always been my sanctuary, a place where I can escape the noise of the world and find peace in the solitude of nature. I've hiked its many paths countless times, each trail as familiar to me as the lines on my own hands. But there's one trail that I wish I had never taken, a trail that has haunted my dreams ever since I first set foot on it. It was a crisp autumn morning when I decided to hike a lesser-known section of the trail. The trees were just beginning to change color, their leaves painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and yellow. The air was cool, with just enough of a bite to remind me that winter was on its way. I had planned to spend the entire day hiking, to lose myself in the beauty of the forest and return home with the satisfaction of a long day's walk behind me. The trail I chose was one I had heard about from other hikers, a narrow, winding path that led deep into the heart of the mountains. It was rarely used, they said, overgrown in places and difficult to follow. But that was exactly what I was looking for, an adventure, a chance to explore a part of the trail that few others had seen. I set off early, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. The trailhead was easy enough to find, a small, weathered sign marking the entrance to the path. The first few miles were uneventful, the trail winding through dense forest, the ground covered in a thick blanket of fallen leaves. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the ground and the occasional rustle of a squirrel in the underbrush. As I continued, the trail became less defined, the trees growing closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and I found myself having to stop frequently to make sure I was still on the right path. But despite the challenges, I pressed on, determined to see where the trail would lead. After a few hours of hiking, I came to a clearing in the forest. It was a small, circular patch of grass, surrounded by towering trees. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone marker, its surface weathered and worn by time. Curious, I approached the marker, my eyes scanning the inscription carved into the stone. The writing was faint, almost unreadable, but I could just make out the words. To those who wander, beware the watcher in the woods. A chill ran down my spine as I read the words, but I quickly brushed it off as a trick of the mind. It was probably just an old warning, meant to deter trespassers or poachers. I had seen similar markers on other trails, most of them little more than relics of a bygone era. Still, there was something about the inscription that unsettled me, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. I continued on, the trail now little more than a faint line in the grass. The forest around me seemed to grow darker, the trees more twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I told myself it was just the wind, the sound of the leaves rustling in the breeze. But the further I walked, the louder the whispering became, until it seemed to be all around me, filling my ears with its insistent murmur. As the day wore on, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. It was as if the forest itself was watching me, its unseen eyes tracking my every move. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more frequently, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing there, just the empty trail and the trees, silent and still. By late afternoon, I decided it was time to turn back. I had seen enough, and the thought of hiking back through the darkening forest was becoming less and less appealing. I retraced my steps, the trail now even harder to follow in the fading light. The whispering continued, growing louder as I made my way back to the clearing. It was no longer just a sound carried by the wind. It was a voice, distant, but distinct, its words just beyond the edge of comprehension. When I reached the clearing, I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The stone marker was gone. In its place was a small, freshly dug mound of earth, as if something had been buried there. I stared at the mound, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had I taken a wrong turn? Was this a different clearing? But no, I was certain this was the same spot, the same trees, the same path leading out of the forest. A sense of dread settled over me as I stood there, the whispering now a constant drone in my ears. I didn't want to stay there any longer. I turned and hurried back down the trail, my pace quickening with every step. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes, their roots tripping me up as I tried to make my way back to safety. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a voice, it was voices, many of them, all speaking at once, their words a jumbled, incomprehensible mess. I stumbled and fell, my hands digging into the cold, damp earth as I tried to push myself back up. As I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees, a figure, tall and thin, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the trail now barely visible in the darkness. The whispering grew louder, the voices now shouting, screaming in my ears. I could feel the figure behind me, its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I ran faster than I ever had before, the trees blurring around me as I tore through the forest, desperate to escape. When I finally burst out of the woods and onto the main trail, I collapsed, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The whispering stopped as suddenly as it had begun, the forest around me once again silent and still. I lay there for a long time, trying to calm my racing thoughts, to convince myself that it had all been in my head. But deep down I knew that something had followed me out of those woods, something that didn't belong in this world. I never hiked that trail again, and I never told anyone about what I experienced that day. But every time I go into the mountains, I can feel it, the watcher in the woods, always there, always watching. And I know that one day I'll have to face it again. Working on a film set can be an exhilarating experience. The long hours, the creative energy, the sense of camaraderie among the cast and crew, all of it combines to create a unique environment that's both demanding and rewarding. But sometimes there's an undercurrent, a feeling that something isn't quite right. And when you're shooting a horror movie, those feelings are easy to dismiss as just part of the job. After all, you're dealing with scary stories and creepy settings all day long. But what if the things you're filming aren't just stories? What if the horror you're creating starts to seep into the real world? That's what happened during the production of Shadows in the Dark, a low-budget horror film that should have been just another job. But it turned out to be something much more sinister. I was a production assistant on the film, my first job in the industry. I was eager, maybe a little naive, but I was thrilled to be part of something creative, something that felt bigger than myself. The director, Mark Langston, was known for his passion and attention to detail, and he had high hopes for the film despite its modest budget. The script was a classic haunted house story, nothing too groundbreaking, but solid enough to keep audiences on the edge of their seats. The setting was an old, abandoned mansion that the production company had rented for the shoot. It was perfect creaky floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and an air of neglect that was almost palpable. The place had a history, too, but no one paid much attention to the rumors of it being haunted. We were making a horror movie, after all, so a few ghost stories were just par for the course. The first couple of weeks went smoothly enough, with only the usual minor hiccups that come with any film production. But then things started to get strange. It started with the lights. We were shooting a particularly intense scene late at night, where the lead actress, Sarah, was supposed to be alone in the house, hearing strange noises. The cinematographer, Dave, had set up the lighting perfectly, casting long shadows that added to the eerie atmosphere. But as we started rolling, the lights began to flicker. At first, we thought it was just a technical issue with wiring in the mansion. Maybe. But it kept happening, always at the same moment in the scene, just as Sarah was about to deliver her lines. We checked the equipment, replaced the bulbs, and even brought in a generator to ensure we had a stable power source. But nothing worked. The lights kept flickering, and every time they did, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, like they were moving on their own. Mark, ever the perfectionist, was frustrated, but he pushed through it. We eventually got the shot, though it took far longer than it should have. But that was just the beginning. The next incident happened a few days later. We were filming a scene in the mansion's basement, a dark, cramped space that was supposed to be the location of the house's darkest secrets. The air down there was thick and musty, and no one liked spending more time there than necessary. We had rigged up some special effects for the scene, simple stuff, fog machines, a few props meant to look like ancient artifacts. As we were setting up, one of the crew members, Tony, went missing. At first, we thought he had just stepped out for a break, but when he didn't return after 20 minutes, we started to get worried. We searched the basement, calling his name, but there was no answer. Finally, we found him in one of the back rooms, standing completely still, staring at the wall. His face was pale, and he was shaking. When we finally got him to speak, all he could say was that he had heard something. Voices, he said, whispering his name, telling him to come closer. He couldn't remember how he had ended up in the room, or why he had been standing there for so long. Tony was a practical guy, not prone to flights of fancy, but whatever he had experienced down there had shaken him to his core. He quit the production the next day, and we had to scramble to find a replacement. After that, the atmosphere on set changed. People were on edge, jumpy, and it wasn't just because of the long hours. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. The final straw came during the shoot for the film's climax, a scene where Sarah's character confronts the malevolent spirit that has been haunting the house. We had been building up to this moment for weeks, and everyone was determined to get it right. As we were setting up, I noticed something strange in the footage we had shot earlier that day. In the background of one of the scenes, there was a shadowed, dark, humanoid shape that didn't belong there. It wasn't one of the crew members, and it wasn't part of the set. It was just there, lurking in the corner of the frame, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I showed it to Mark, thinking it was just a trick of the light, maybe a problem with the camera. But as we reviewed the footage, we saw it again and again in different scenes, always in the background, always watching. Mark was a skeptic, not one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but even he couldn't explain it. We tried to rationalize it, to come up with some logical explanation, but deep down, we all knew something was wrong. That night, as we filmed the final scene, everything that had been building up came to a head. We were in the mansion's grand foyer, the centerpiece of the film's haunted house. The camera was rolling, the lights were dim, and Sarah was giving it her all, pouring every ounce of fear and desperation into her performance. And then the lights went out. It wasn't a flicker this time, it was a total blackout. The set was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, There was nothing but the sound of our own breathing, the sense of something terrible closing in around us. About then, the screaming started. It wasn't Sarah, it was one of the crew members, a young woman named Emily, who had been working on the props. She was screaming, a high-pitched, panicked wail that echoed through the mansion. We scrambled to find our flashlights, to get the lights back on. But in the darkness, everything was chaos. When we finally got the lights back on, we found Emily in the corner of the room, curled up in a ball, sobbing uncontrollably. She kept saying that she had seen something in the dark, something with eyes that glowed like embers. We called off the shoot for the night, and everyone went home, shaken and exhausted. The next day, Mark announced that we were shutting down production. He didn't give a reason, just said that it was over, that we weren't going to finish the film. The official story was that the project had run out of money, that the investors had pulled out. But those of us who were there that night knew the truth. We had seen something on that set, something that didn't want to be filmed, something that had made its presence known in no uncertain terms. The mansion was closed up after that, left to decay even further. No one ever tried to film there again, and Shadows in the Dark was never completed. The footage we had shot was locked away, and as far as I know, no one has seen it since I left the film industry not long after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had disturbed on that set wasn't done with us, that it might follow us, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that mansion, about the shadows that shouldn't have been there, about the eyes that watched us from the darkness. And every time I wake up in a cold sweat, I remind myself that some stories are better left untold. The clock struck midnight as I pulled into the parking lot of the old factory, its looming silhouette casting long, ominous shadows under the dim light of the moon. This place had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era, but tonight I was here for a job as security shift that was supposed to be a simple one. Just a few hours of walking through empty hallways, making sure no one had broken in, and then I'd be free to go. The money was good to pass up, especially for something so straightforward. Or so I thought. As I stepped out of my car, the chill in the air made me pull my jacket tighter around me. The factory was massive, with rows of broken windows and rusted metal doors, the walls covered in graffiti that had faded with time. The wind whistled through the cracks, creating an eerie melody that seemed to welcome me in. I shook off the feeling of unease and made my way to the entrance, the keys jangling in my hand as I unlocked the heavy steel door. Inside, the factory was a maze of corridors and staircases, all leading to different sections of the building. My footsteps echoed through the empty space as I walked, the sound bouncing off the cold, concrete walls. The power had been cut off years ago, so I relied on my flashlight to guide me through the darkness. It wasn't my first time working a shift like this, but something about this place felt different, almost alive. I started my rounds, checking each room and corridor for any signs of intruders. The factory had been used to manufacture textiles in the 1950s, but now it was just a shell of what it once was. The machines were rusted and covered in dust, their gears frozen in time. I made my way to the main floor, where the largest machines were still bolted to the ground, their once gleaming surfaces now dull and corroded. I couldn't help but imagine the workers who had spent their days here toiling away under the harsh glare of industrial lights. It must have been a different world back then, one that had long since been forgotten. As I continued my patrol, I began to notice something strange. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. My flashlight flickered, the beam of light dimming for a moment before returning to full strength. I cursed under my breath, tapping it against my hand, but the unease continued to grow. In the back of the factory, there was a section that had been cordoned off with old, rusted chains. A sign hung on the gate, its letters barely visible in the darkness. "Do not enter." I had been instructed to avoid this area, as it was considered unsafe due to structural damage. But something drew me toward it, a pull that I couldn't explain. Ignoring the warning, I carefully stepped over the chains and made my way into the forbidden section. This part of the factory was different from the rest. The walls were lined with old photos and documents, remnants of the factory's past. I shone my flashlight on the images, the faces of the workers staring back at me with hollow eyes. There was a sense of history here, something dark and unsettling that lingered in the air. I moved deeper into the section, my footsteps slow and cautious. Then I heard a faint whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound had already faded. My heart pounded in my chest as I swept the flashlight around, searching for the source of the noise. The beam of light caught something in the corner of the room, a figure standing motionless in the shadows. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could see its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in on me from all sides. Finally, I managed to break free and sprinted back toward the main section of the factory. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the darkness closing in from all sides. My flashlight flickered again, and this time it went out completely, plunging me into pitch blackness. I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to turn on the flashlight app, but my hands were shaking too badly. As I ran, I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. They weren't mine. These footsteps were heavier, deliberate, and they echoed ominously through the empty halls. The whispers returned, this time louder, surrounding me from all directions. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, vengeful. I finally reached the entrance, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the door and burst outside. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I gasped for breath, my heart racing. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, practically throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands were still shaking as I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't look back as I sped away from the factory. The memory of those glowing eyes burned into my mind. I never returned to that place, never told anyone what had happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, and I can't help but wonder what I might have seen if I had stayed just a moment longer. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't human. I had always been an adventurer, a lover of the wild and the untouched. The sound of rustling leaves, the scent of pine, and the sight of towering trees made me feel alive in a way that nothing else ever could. Camping was my escape, my way to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life and reconnect with something more primal. But there's a certain danger in isolation, a risk that comes with venturing too far from civilization. A lesson I learned the hard way. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote area of the Adirondack Mountains. I had been there before, but only on the well-traveled trails, the ones that were popular with hikers and day trippers. This time I wanted something different. I wanted solitude, a chance to truly be alone with nature. So I chose a less-known area, a place where the forest was dense and the paths were few, a place where I could go days without seeing another human being. I packed light, just the essentials, a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for a week, and my trusty old backpack. The drive to the trailhead took most of the day, the road winding through small towns and past endless stretches of forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. I parked my car, shouldered my pack, and set off into the woods, eager to reach my campsite before dark. The trail was narrow, barely more than a deer path, and it quickly disappeared into the thick undergrowth. I had to push through bushes and step over fallen logs, my progress slow but steady. The forest around me was quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. As the light faded, I found myself relying more and more on my headlamp to see the way ahead. After a few hours of hiking, I found a small clearing by a creek and decided to set up camp. The spot was perfect, secluded and peaceful, with just enough room for my tent and a small fire. I pitched the tent quickly, my hands moving with practiced ease, and soon had a fire crackling in the fire pit I had built. The warmth of the flames was comforting, a small barrier against the encroaching darkness. As I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what I had been looking for, complete and utter solitude, a chance to unwind and recharge. The stars began to appear overhead, twinkling through the gaps in the tree canopy, and I felt a deep sense of contentment wash over me. But as the night wore on, the silence began to weigh on me. It was different from the usual quiet of the woods, the kind of silence that you could almost feel pressing down on your shoulders. There were no animals rustling in the underbrush, no insects buzzing in the air. Even the creek seemed to flow more softly, its babbling reduced to a mere whisper. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation. But the unease lingered, a persistent itch at the back of my mind. I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would come quickly and that I would wake up to the familiar sounds of the forest in the morning. But sleep did not come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the roof of the tent, listening to the silence. It was unnerving, unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was something out there in the darkness, watching me. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, that I had spent too much time alone and my mind was starting to wander. But the feeling only grew stronger as the night wore on. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. It was faint, just a soft rustling, like the wind in the trees. But there was no wind. I lay there, my heart racing, listening intently. The sound came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate shuffling of feet in the leaves. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. My eyes were wide, straining to see through the darkness. I reached for the knife I kept by my side, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle. The rustling continued, moving around the tent, circling it. I could hear it more clearly now, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, as I listened to the sound. It was getting closer, the footsteps growing louder, more distinct. I could hear the leaves rustling, the twigs snapping underfoot. It was right outside the tent, now just inches away. I could see the silhouette of something moving against the thin fabric, its shadow looming over me. I was frozen with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure outside the tent stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, the zipper of the tent began to move, the sound loud in the stillness of the night. I tightened my grip on the knife, my mind racing, trying to decide what to do. But before I could make a move, the zipper stopped, and the figure outside the tent moved away. I sat there, trembling, as the footsteps receded into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like hours, my mind replaying the events over and over. Eventually, the adrenaline began to wear off, and I collapsed back onto my sleeping bag, exhausted and terrified. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness, waiting for the figure to return. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I wasted no time packing up my cap. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about the trail. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I hiked back to my car in record time, barely stopping to catch my breath, my mind consumed with the events of the previous night. As I drove away from the trailhead, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me. But there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I never returned to that spot, never told anyone about what happened, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of those footsteps in the night, and I'll never camp alone again. It was the dead of winter when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the dense, snow-covered woods just outside of town. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work and needed some time alone to clear my head. The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape from the pressures of life and just breathe. I had camped here dozens of times before, but something about this trip felt different, like the woods were waiting for me. The drive up was uneventful, the winding roads slick with ice as I navigated my way through the snow-covered landscape. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I parked my truck and grabbed my gear, pulling my coat tighter around me to keep out the biting cold. The air was crisp and silent, the only sound the crunch of snow under my boots as I made my way into the woods. As I walked, the trees seemed to close in around me, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The path was barely visible under the thick layer of snow, but I knew these woods well enough to find my way even in the dark. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, far from any other campers or hikers, where I could truly be alone. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, that familiar sense of peace I usually felt began to fade, replaced by a growing unease. I reached my campsite just as the last light of day disappeared behind the trees. The clearing was small, surrounded on all sides by towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night sky. I quickly set up my tent and got a fire going, the flames casting flickering shadows across the snow. The warmth of the fire was a welcome relief from the cold, and I settled down with a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had been nagging at me since I arrived. The night was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest rustling leaves, distant animal calls conspicuously absent. The only noise was the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I sat there, staring into the flames, I suddenly heard a low, guttural howl it echoed through the trees. My blood ran cold, and I instinctively reached for the hunting knife at my side. The howl was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, deep and resonant, like the cry of some ancient, primal beast. It sent a wave of fear through me, the kind that makes your heart race and your mind scream at you to run. But I didn't run. Instead, I stood up slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The firelight only reached so far, leaving the edges of the clearing shrouded in shadow. The howl came again, closer this time, and I could feel the ground vibrate beneath my feet as if something massive was moving through the forest. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. Wolves weren't uncommon in these woods, but this didn't sound like a wolf. It sounded human, almost, but distorted, like a man in the throes of some terrible agony. I backed away from the fire, my eyes straining to see into the darkness beyond the clearing. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse, barely more than a shadow, moving between the trees. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, its body hunched and covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, a sickly yellow that pierced through the night like a pair of burning coals. I could see the outline of its limbs, long, muscular arms ending in sharp, clawed hands. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, watching me with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. I held my breath, hoping against hope that it would lose interest and move on. But the creature didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head back and let out another howl, this one so loud and piercing that it made my ears ring. The sound was filled with rage, with pain, with something ancient and powerful that I couldn't begin to comprehend. Panic set in, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my pack and bolted for the truck, not caring about the gear I was leaving behind. I could hear the creature crashing through the trees behind me, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground as it gave chase. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, the cold air burning my lungs and my legs screaming in protest. But I didn't dare slow down. The path back to the truck was a blur of snow and darkness, the trees whipping past me as I ran. I could hear the creature gaining on me, its howls filling the night with an otherworldly terror that spurred me to keep going. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline, every instinct telling me that if I stopped, even for a second, it would be the end. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my truck parked just ahead. I didn't slow down, not even as I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took several tries to get the door open. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. The creature's howls were deafening now, but as I started the engine and hit the gas, they began to fade into the distance. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my home, miles away from those cursed woods. Even then, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes, that massive, hulking figure that had chased me through the snow. I don't know what it was that I encountered out there, but I know one thing: I'll never go back to those woods again. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me. I hear that howl in my dreams, a sound that no man or beast should ever make. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear it again, calling to me from the depths of the forest, reminding me that there are things out there in the dark that we were never meant to understand. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, you hear the stories. Tales of strange creatures lurking in the dense forest, of shadowy figures glimpsed out of the corner of your eye, of the wild places that people just don't go. Most folks dismiss them as just that, stories, myths passed down from one generation to the next. But for those of us who spend time in the wilderness, who know these woods like the back of our hand, there's always that nagging doubt, that little voice in the back of your mind that wonders, what if? My family has owned a cabin deep in the Cascade Mountains for as long as I can remember. It's a small, rustic place, no electricity, no running water, just a couple of rooms and a wood stove to keep out the cold. But it's always been a sanctuary for us, a place to escape from the pressures of modern life and reconnect with nature. Every summer, we'd pack up the car and head to the cabin for a few weeks. My parents, my younger sister Emma, and me. It was our tradition, and I love every minute of it. The smell of the pine trees, the crisp mountain air, the sound of the wind whispering through the trees at night. It was peaceful, serene, a world away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. But that summer was different. It started like any other. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. We unloaded the car and packed our things and settled in for the evening. My dad got a fire going in the stove, while my mom and Emma prepared dinner. I decided to take a walk down to the river that ran behind the cabin, something I'd done countless times before. The path to the river was well worn, a narrow trail that wound through the trees, the sound of the rushing water growing louder with each step. I reached the river bank and stood there for a while, just taking it all in. The water was clear and cold, reflecting the deep blue of the sky above. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool, fresh air, feeling the stress of the long drive melt away. But as I stood there, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague sense of unease, like I was being watched. I opened my eyes and looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the trees, the river, and the mountains in the distance. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I'd been cooped up in the car too long and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got stronger, more insistent, like a low hum that I couldn't ignore. That's when I heard it, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was low, guttural, almost like a growl, but deeper, more resonant, like something huge was lurking just out of sight. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to look in the direction it had come from. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees, tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But then I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of dark fur, a massive shape moving through the underbrush, just beyond the edge of the trail. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, much bigger than any animal I'd ever seen in these woods. I couldn't see it clearly, just the outline, the shape of something walking on two legs, its head nearly level with the lower branches of the trees. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, trying not to draw its attention. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where I'd seen it, praying it wouldn't notice me, that it would just keep moving and leave me alone. But then it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, slowly, it turned and looked directly at me. I couldn't see its eyes, not clearly, but I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, like it was sizing me up, deciding whether I was a threat or prey. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing, and all I could do was stand there, locked in place, as this thing stared at me from the shadows. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it turned away and disappeared into the trees, moving with a speed and grace that didn't seem possible for something so large. I waited until I was sure it was gone before I finally allowed myself to breathe. I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins. When I burst through the door, Out of breath and shaking, my parents looked at me like I was crazy. "What's wrong?" my dad asked, his voice filled with concern. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. I sounded like a madman, rambling about something big in the woods, something that shouldn't be there. My dad tried to reassure me, told me it was probably just a bear, that I had startled it and it had run off. But I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't a bear. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing in the trees, felt its gaze boring into me, cold and unfeeling. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, to every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, making my heart race. Around midnight I heard it again, that low, guttural growl, this time much closer. I sat up in bed, my heart in my throat, straining to hear it again. For a moment there was nothing but silence. And then, just outside the window, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Something big moving through the brush. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, my hands shaking as I pulled back the curtain. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the clearing in front of the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. But then I saw it just at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, a massive, dark figure, standing on two legs, watching the cabin. It was closer now, much closer than before. I could see the outline of its broad shoulders, the thick fur covering its body, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows, almost like it was part of the forest itself. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would hear me. I wanted to scream, to wake up my parents, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could do was stand there, frozen with fear, as that thing watched us from the edge of the trees. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and vanished into the forest, moving with that same unnatural speed. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to come back, but it didn't. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, my body shaking with fear. The next morning, I told my parents what I had seen, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to an overactive imagination, told me I had probably just seen a deer or a shadow, and let my mind play tricks on me. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was real. But we stayed at the cabin for another week, but I refused to go outside alone. I spent most of my time inside, too scared to venture into the woods, too scared to be anywhere near the windows at night. I didn't see the creature again, but I could feel it out there, watching, waiting. When we finally left the cabin and drove back home, I felt a sense of relief like I had never experienced before. I was glad to be leaving the mountains behind, glad to be going back to the safety of the city. But the fear stayed with me, a nagging sense of dread that I couldn't shake. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in those woods. Maybe it was Bigfoot, or maybe it was something else entirely, something that doesn't have a name. All I know is that it was real, and it was watching me. And whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I'll hear that low growl in my dreams, and I'll see those dark, cold eyes staring at me from the shadows. And in those moments, I'm right back in those woods, frozen in fear, knowing that some things are better left unseen. It was a long drive, the kind that stretches your patience thin and makes you wish you'd planned better. I had been on the road for hours, the scenery blurring together into an endless monotony of trees and open fields. The GPS had directed me onto a back road, a shortcut it claimed would save me time. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I started to regret taking it. There was nothing but wilderness for miles, no sign of civilization, and my gas gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. Just as I was starting to panic, I saw it. A small, weathered sign by the side of the road, its paint faded and peeling. Tenaview Motel. Vacancy, the letters were barely legible, but I didn't care. It was the first sign of life I'd seen in over an hour, and I wasn't about to pass it up. The motel appeared out of the trees like something out of a different era, a relic from the 1960s that had somehow survived into the present day. The building was a single-story L shape, with a flickering neon sign out front that spelled Pinaview in bright red letters. A few cars were parked in front of the rooms, their owners likely already settled in for the night. The place didn't look like much, but it was clean, and most importantly, it was somewhere I could rest my head for the night. I parked my car near the office and went inside. The air was thick with the smell of cigarette smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. The walls were lined with old wood paneling, and a dusty ceiling fan creaked overhead. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his hair thin and white, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He looked up as I entered, a smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "Evening," he greeted me, his voice raspy. "Looking for a room?" "Yeah, just for the night," I replied, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that was beginning to settle in my stomach. "Room 8 is open," he said, sliding a key across the counter. "That'll be $40. I handed over the cash and took the key. The old man watched me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, but I forced a smile and thanked him. As I turned to leave, he called out after me. "Be sure to lock the door," he said, his voice low and serious, "and don't open it for anyone." I nodded, more eager than ever to get to my room. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, a welcome relief from the stuffy office. I found room 8 at the far end of the building, the door a faded green with chipped paint. The key turned in the lock with a metallic click, and I stepped inside. The room was small, with just a bed, a knit stand, and a television that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. The wallpaper was a hideous floral pattern, yellowed with age, and the carpet was a dull brown, worn thin in places. A single window overlooked the parking lot, the curtains drawn tight against the night. The bedspread was a faded blue, the kind you'd expect to find in a place like this, and the air was musty, as if the room hadn't been aired out in a long time. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was clean, and after hours on the road, that was all I cared about. I locked the door behind me, remembering the old man's warning, and set my bag down on the bed. I was exhausted, my body aching from the drive, and all I wanted was to sleep. But as I sat down, something caught my eye. Across the room, hanging on the wall above the dresser, was a large, ornate mirror. It was out of place in a room like this, too grand and expensive-looking for such a run-down motel. The frame was gilded with intricate carvings that shimmered in the dim light. I stood up and walked over to the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. There was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. The glass was clean, free of dust or smudges, but the reflection seemed wrong. My face looked the same, but there was an unsettling darkness in my eyes, a shadow that didn't belong. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many hours on the road and too little sleep. I pulled the curtains shut, plunging the room into darkness, and climbed into bed. The mattress was lumpy and uncomfortable, the sheets thin and scratchy, but I was too tired to care. I turned off the light, the room sinking into pitch black, and closed my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the bed creaking under my weight, my mind refusing to quiet. I kept thinking about the mirror, about the strange reflection that had looked back at me. I told myself it was just the fatigue, that I was imagining things, but the unease lingered. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, the room was still dark. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing, and I lay there in the silence, trying to figure out what had woken me. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to indicate that anything was wrong. But I could feel it, a presence in the room, something watching me. I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. The room was as it had been when I'd gone to bed, the curtains drawn tight, the door locked. But the unease was back, stronger now, a cold dread that seeped into my bones. I looked around, trying to shake off the feeling, when my gaze landed on the mirror. Even in the darkness, I could see it, a faint outline against the wall. And then I saw it, a shadow in the glass, something moving behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned slowly, my eyes wide with fear. But there was nothing there, just the empty room, the bed, and the dresser. I turned back to the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow was gone, the reflection normal, but the fear remained, a cold, creeping terror that refused to let go. I jumped out of bed, my hands trembling, and reached for the light switch. The room flooded with light, and I spun around, expecting to see something, anything. But the room was empty, just as it had been when I'd first walked in. I looked back at the mirror, but the reflection was normal again, just me standing in an empty room. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, that I'd woken up disoriented and confused. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could still feel it, the presence, the eyes watching me. I grabbed my bag, throwing my things inside with shaky hands, and headed for the door. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night, or that I didn't have another place to stay. I just needed to get out of there. As I reached for the doorknob, the lights flickered, casting the room in an eerie, stuttering glow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The mirror, I had to look, to make sure. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and my eyes met the glass. My reflection was staring back at me. But it wasn't me. The face in the mirror was twisted, a grotesque mockery of my own features. The eyes were hollow, the mouth twisted into a cruel smile, and the skin was pale, almost translucent. The figure reached out, its hand pressing against the glass from the inside. And then, slowly, it began to crawl out. I screamed, stumbling back, my back hitting the door with a thud. The lights flickered again, and the figure in the mirror froze, its twisted face inches from mine. The lights flickered one last time, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I don't know how I got out of that room, how I managed to fumble with the lock and throw the door open. I ran to my car, my heart racing, and drove away without looking back. The road was empty, the night stretching out before me, and I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never returned to that motel, never told anyone what happened. But I can't forget it, the image of that twisted face in the mirror, the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I still see it, lurking just behind my reflection, waiting for the right moment to come out.